before we get started, I would like to talk a little bit about belt anatomy. A belt is made of multiple parts. It has a ring at the beginning to allow it to be tied, sometimes more than one ring at the beginning. It has its material that it is made out of. It might be macrame cord, it might be cotton, it might be paracord, it might be a mix of those, or it might be something else entirely. There is the weave, which is the function and the mechanism by which the cord is put together. The weave determines how the cords move from the beginning of the belt to the end. The pattern is the colors that are applied over the weave. For example, these two belts are the same weave, but different materials and different patterns with different colors. The next piece of a belt is its end knot. There should be something at the end that secures the belt. Make sure it will not unravel over time. And this end knot has a function and can be decorative as well. And then there is the tail. You gotta do something with the rest of the cord at the end. And then there are the tail knots, or the tail finishing. Sometimes this isn't knotted, it's just melted and squished, and that's fine. But there should be something at the end of your tail. Alright, today I am going to talk about judging woven belts. My name is Sir Léal Fitzmorgan de Junshin. I am a Master Owl for belt weaving. You see in front of you a number of belts that I have around the house. Some of them are display pieces. A lot of them are being given away very soon, and a few of them are things that are sort of in stock at the moment. So, this is a good time for me to describe a lot of things about belt weaving. When I talk about judging, and when I do judging for woven belts, I break belt judging itself into two categories. One, artistry, and two, technique. I consider artistry to be more important than technique overall, because the impact of a piece, even if it is imperfect, can really hit home for someone. Now, as you can see here, woven belts need not simply be an indicator of status or station or belonging, but even when they are simple, there is an artistry to the work that needs to be considered. So, here's what I look for in order of importance. First, composition. Is the belt laid out well? Will it, when it is worn on the body, have the intended effect? For example, I have a belt here, which I will show you in a moment, that has multiple patterns of woven in different woven sections. It begins with this interlaced braid and continues and then shifts into a chevron, which turns around, shifts into the other direction of chevron, and then turns back into that same interlaced braid. And it has a sun knot at the end. This belt is meant to look like fire, and the chevron section is meant to sit along the back from hip to hip. So as I was judging that belt, I would ask myself, is this going to fit the intended wearer such that that section of chevron from hip to hip is going to fit properly? Similarly, are the colors appropriate to the intention of the piece? If I have something that is meant to look like the Earth Nation, are the colors appropriate? Does that hit the right vibe? And is the weave appropriate? Is the chosen weave indicative of that feeling? Next, I would ask about material. Is the material chosen for this piece appropriate you will find that paracord has a tendency to create fluffier lines, and so it fills gaps nicely. But it can be pulled into tension such that it is nice and tight and gives clean lines. Paracord is slightly less forgiving. It gives very, very clean lines, clean, sharp lines, like the body of this piece is. The body of this piece here is made of paracord with a little bit of very thin macrame in it to make for very thin lines. This belt is entirely paracord and makes for very, very clean lines. There's one belt in here that is mostly cotton. It is this one. Cotton is a little bit more difficult, especially in this particular weave, as it likes to stick together. So all of those pieces are something I would consider. Next, I would ask about a story or a theme. Is there a theme that is intended? When I look for somebody who is at their 9th and they're looking for 10th or masterhood in this direction, or this is meant to be a really high level piece, I want to look for creativity. I want that belt to tell a story on its own. So those are the things that I would consider when I am judging a piece for artistry. I look at its composition, its colors, its weave, its material, and its story and its theme. And do all of those pieces play together well to create an impactful piece? Next, I look at technique, because artistry is very, very important, and I weight it heavily over good technique. Bad technique can completely ruin a story. So it is important to still do things well. So here's what I look for, and this is in order of importance, because a belt, if it is to tell a story, must function. First, is the piece going to fall apart? Are all of the strands securely attached to the ring? Or are they added into the weave appropriately? Is the end knot sufficiently secure? As in, is there a knot under it or something else that will keep the piece from slipping, keep the weave from slipping over time? Are the tail ends melted or otherwise finished so they won't ruin the look or the integrity of the piece? For example, this belt here. This is something that I would consider a very average to slightly less than average belt. It is simple in design. It has, as far as we know, no knot underneath the weave. I can't feel anything here, which is where that knot would be, nor do I see anything here underneath the knot here. And this is a simple wrap knot that is only melted into place. There's every chance that this could slip down, and will slip down over time, although it is less likely with macrame cord. However, the tail ends are at least finished, so this is not going to fray and then ruin the piece from the bottom up. I have seen intentionally frayed, and I have done myself intentionally frayed tail knots, because you get a very fluffy look with macrame cord. But if you were to do that, you must knot things off appropriately so that that fraying will not continue up the belt. So, that is stability. Next, consistency. Are all of the rows consistently sized? If they are not, do they have good reason to be? And honestly, more importantly, is the belt the same width all the way down? As an example, I might pick up this belt. It is generally the same width all the way down the piece. And all of the rows are the same size. However, this Water Nation belt, which I will pick up in a moment, the rows are not all the same size, and this is intentional. You will notice if we look closely that these rows here, each stitch is wider and then skinnier on the edges. And that is in order to allow the tension in the vertical direction to be shifted so that the horizontal tension stays consistent. And this belt is approximately the same size, if not exactly the same size, all the way down the piece. That's what I look for when I look for tension. It is very okay for tension to be manipulated as long as the piece overall looks even and intentional. So I would look for things like, does the weave get weirdly bunched up or loosened anywhere? And if the belt is in a knotted style, like a true macrame rather than a weaving, are those knots evenly done? We could look at these two belts here. They are the same weave, so they're good for comparison. To compare, we will note that the maroon belt here is much more even than the gold and white belt. The gold and white belt still looks good, sure, but it is not as even. The center of this weave does not show up as nicely in the gold in some places, as it does pretty consistently throughout that matte maroon belt. Next I look for tension. Tension in and of itself. Is the belt so loose? The belt weave so loose that you can see gaping holes in it? Is there unintentional checkering, which is when the weft, the strands that go left to right or weft to white, do those poke through unintentionally? I'm going to bring this belt back here. There is some checkering here at the very top, which is more okay at the top with this type of attachment, because it's hard to get things so tight properly at the beginning. But checkering is when this gold weft here is showing through that warp, that blue warp. And if you bend it, it is okay if there's a little bit of checkering when you bend the piece, because it's not meant to be worn bent like that. You see, even on a very nicely tensioned piece, you can still, if you bend it, you can still see the black through the pattern. But what you want is to not be able to see light through it. So that is consistency and tension. And next I look for functionality. Can the belt be comfortably tied? Is the end knot or the tail too complex or too large to nicely fit through the ring? Are there any sharp decorations or melted portions that are sticking out and might cause injury? Next, if the belt is intended for field use, are there any elements that might injure the wearer or another fighter if that belt is hit, landed on when taking a knee, or something similar? As an example, with these nation belts, inspired by Avatar The Last Airbender, there are some massive hand-carved beads on here. And these are a little difficult to get through. And there are some tail knots here, which have been intentionally cascaded in length to help the wearer get the belt through the loop. As you can see, even with the cascading, this is a little bit difficult because the ring is slightly too small for all of that mass. And then you can see here you have to be very careful. Like, it's not so bad with this one, but you have to be careful putting these extra decoration knots and the wood piece there through the ring. And so that is something that I would consider perhaps not as easily functional as I would like it to be. So when it comes to technique, again, I am looking for stability, consistency, tension, and functionality. And all of those pieces should work, because if those pieces don't work, the belt doesn't work. Now, let's talk about this belt here, which is made of macrame cord and tapered to the end. You'll notice there's no knot here. There's no tail. It is all melted into place. And this has been very carefully melted so that it will not fall apart. And this is something that I would look at very, very carefully as a judge. You want to make sure that if someone has tapered a belt off like this in macrame cord or in paracord, that none of these pieces are going to very easily fall apart. You can see that these are all very thoroughly melted into place, all of these cut off strands. So that scores well for functionality and stability there, because that tapered end here is going to fit very, very nicely through my ring. And when it is tied in this direction, this can very easily be worn and tied in a way that these dark gray pieces don't show. On a similar taper here, this is done in macrame cord, in paracord with macrame on the sides. And we'll note here that there's some melted pieces where these green weft chunks have come through, have been finished off in the end here. And those have been very carefully hidden by the next row, so there's nothing sharp here that's going to show up and cause injury. And we see that there's a little bit of work here to cover up paracord, which when melted has a tendency to get darker than macrame cord does. So there's a little bit of effort here to cover up that dark tan color of melted paracord on a white belt. And this end here is very carefully melted, very thoroughly. The macrame cord is what is melted here to make sure that everything stays together. And then this extra decoration also hides some of those same issues when the weave was tapered down. And then this piece in particular is extremely consistent throughout. The tension is almost perfect row to row, and it is extremely consistent in width row to row. And then if we look at it in functionality, we want to make sure that this piece can be fit through the ring, and while it doesn't go through quite as nicely with the animal head here, we do see that it can go through just fine like that and be put through this way. Perhaps, again, not quite as well as one might like, but it does work. So we've talked about artistry, and we've talked about technique. In artistry, we've talked about composition, colors, weave, material, story, and theme. And in technique, we've talked about stability, consistency, tension, and functionality. Now I want to go through and talk a little bit about identifying and assessing those complex techniques. We've already talked about a few of them. First one I want to mention is tension manipulation. Sometimes weaves will intentionally travel back and forth in weird ways, or move in weird directions. And as long as this work is consistent, that is just fine. And when I look at judging, I personally care more about the consistency of the width than the consistency of the rows themselves, because again, sometimes these have to be manipulated in order to get that fun pattern. And what we'll notice here, this is somewhere where paracord and macrame behave very, very differently, and it shows very clearly. So there's a little bit of a texture change in the fabric when we go from one direction to another. And there's also a tension issue. You can see here, let me exaggerate this a little bit, that this section does not join smoothly with the next section. It can be manipulated into place a little bit, but it's a little rough. Whereas with this Water Nation belt, it is the width is consistent and straight and holds its shape very, very well. Paracord likes to hold its shape, and so sometimes you have to fight with it to get it to sit where you want it to. Now, let me talk about some added extras. There's a lot of different ways that extras can be added, and they should really meet all of the same functionality and consistency criteria as above. So, for example, this belt, let me compare these two. The blue and gold one has a simple tail knot, and some simple knots at the end here, and not tail knots. The maroon belt here has extra decoration knots on top, and a very simple tail knot. So you have to decide, do these extra decoration knots enhance the piece, or make it more confusing, or do they harm the way the piece looks in any way? Similarly, you might look at a belt like this, and it has all of these extra fancy knots at the bottom. And so you have to decide, well, do all of those knots take up too much space to go through the ring nicely? Do they make sense and help tell a story? Or is there anything else going on that might be a little weird there? Or do they just look nice? Are they well done? Similarly with this belt here. This belt has decoration knots, plus the end knot itself is quite long, has decoration knots on top and bottom, and there's an extra decoration on top of that piece already that has been woven in, that has been tied externally, and then it has, again, all of these knots at the end. And you get to decide, is that too much to put through the ring? In this case, the rings are quite large, so it fits pretty well. And does it enhance and tell the story that it's meant to? So those are some options. And then you might have, like on these belts, again, you might have these carved beads. That could be an add-in, and these decorative knotting. So let me talk specifically about some different multimedia things that can be done. You can have beads, which can be anywhere from very simple to very complex. Manufactured beads can be added to the end of a tail very easily, but if they are done that way, they need to be secured so that they won't slide off the end of that tail. And if a belt is meant for fighting, those beads better be soft, or have some other quality that will make sure that they are not going to cause injury if somebody gets hit with them, or if the wearer takes a knee or something similar. Adding beads in to the weave, like along the way. This is not something I've ever done, but it can be far more difficult than just adding it to the tail. Beads could be handmade. These are beads that are hand carved. And doing that is far more difficult than buying some. In all cases, those beads should be securely attached to the belt, and they should enhance the piece. Another way a belt can be multimedia is if it has different types of cord. Using multiple different types of cord can cause tension issues that have to be worked through and balanced as you are weaving. This is a very good example of this. This is a polka dot macrame cord in the red and paracord in the white. And there are some tension issues that happen throughout this belt, where you can see in some places how the macrame cord sort of shows through the paracord. It's not too bad, but overall, using more than one type of cord can cause some tension issues that need to be worked very carefully to make the piece look good and work well. On the other hand, this is a piece that is mostly macrame cord with a little bit of paracord, and that has hardly any tension issues at all. And so sometimes the tension concerns may simply come from a balance of the materials being used. Next, another way that belts can be enhanced is a different type of ring. So this belt has a simple brass style ring. It is a simple ring there. This belt has a simple aluminum ring that is anodized and toned in blue that matches some of the paracord on the piece. This belt has a wooden ring, This is a triangular wooden ring that is actually, it was a bangle in its former life, and it has been turned into a belt ring. This belt, I believe, is a D ring. That is a D ring shape, and that affects how a circular ring versus a D ring will affect how the cord falls into the weave. This belt has a very simple steel ring. This is nickel-plated steel, excuse me. It will not rust. And nickel-plated is important if it's going to be a steel ring so that you avoid rust issues. This has a ring that used to be a belt ring for a leather belt and has been adjusted for macrame. This belt has a floral patterned D ring, and you'll note here that the strands are not tied on, those are just weaved right in, and that is also alright. Just something to pay attention to, because it changes the look of the piece. This is a flat ring that was made out of a ball bearing and has been filled with resin. And so that gives you another dimension of interest. Some people will paint their belt rings, especially if they're engraved, with enamel, and that is a very nice extra touch. That is some good multimedia work. Now I will say, there are a lot of other very creative things that I've not talked about here in terms of adding things to belts. I have seen extra decoration stitched in. I've seen crochet chains added on top. I've seen chainmail added in. I've seen belts that are one section leather and the rest of it macrame cord. I've seen belts that use multiple types of cord to get some excellent texture that's very subtle at a distance, but feels good in the hand. And there's lots and lots of creative things that can be done, but when you're judging it, what you should really do is make sure that those creative additions enhance the piece and don't detract from it. They should all still fit under the artistry and technique characteristics of good composition, good color, good weave choice, good material choice, good story and theme if there's a theme to be had. The belt should still be stable and functional. It should have consistency and good tension. And so as long as all of the fancy stuff is done in a way that enhances the piece, and the piece can still be worn, and it's going to last a long time, then that's a well done piece.